welcome back everybody to the Book of Fables. If you've been listening for long, you know that I like to try to get a broad swath of sources for fables. We've done ancient stories, modern stories, short stories, long stories, and in fact today I think we're going to turn to something a little bit different even. We're going to do a nursery rhyme, which isn't something that we've covered much yet, but it is something that I think that there is a lot of very interesting historical background that we can talk about as relates to this particular rhyme. We have just met in The Wolf Among Us the character of Johann the Butcher, and it was mentioned that he lives on the same block or has a store on the same block as the baker and the candlestick maker. And to me, that calls back to my childhood, where my grandfather, step-grandfather I guess would be, was actually a commercial artist, and so he had painted, and we had up in my room this very nice painting of the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. It was a sort of a combination of a tub and a boat, and they were out at sea, and there were stars out at night and everything. I really remember liking it as a kid. But it came with the rhyme, and so the version of the rhyme that I have always heard was, "Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, and who do you think they be? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. Turn 'em out, knaves all three." Now, if we're going to go into this and do much analysis, obviously there's not a whole lot we can do. This isn't a fable, this is a nursery rhyme, and so a lot of emphasis is put on it rhyming and it being kind of silly and fun. Nevertheless, these things were told and continued on for a reason. And honestly, if we're going to examine this, you might imagine that it has something to do with being a moral fable and possibly about homosexuality, because, you know, three grown men sharing a tub, and they're all considered to be bad people, and they're thrown out of the tub. And that's where I was when I started my research. But as I've dug deeper, what's really interesting is that version is not the final version. That's not what was told in England or in the more modern conception of it that have been made. It instead was the version that was told when people came to America, and so they kind of stagnated at that point. The fairy tale stopped evolving, and it was just sort of told in the way that it was told back then. Obviously, people don't talk about knaves anymore or anything like that, but the most modern conception of the fairy tale, which is still collected in anthologies and things like this, goes as follows. Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, and how do you think they got there? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, they all jumped out of a rotten potato. 'Twas enough to make a man stare. And so it's still the 3 men in a tub, but it has this like fantastical kind of silly element and kind of the gross thing that kids like too. And so from that you can get the idea that whatever this is, it's evolving towards this more ludicrous, fantastical children's understanding of things. And so that's if you take the rhyme forward in time. Now let's take it back. The potato lasted for kind of a while. There was the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. They all went to sea in a great big potato. That one was followed right behind Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker. They all jumped out of a rotten potato. And there, at that point, then we get the Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, who do you think they be? The original rhyme. And again, I'm just going back chronologically in terms of collections. And after that, it starts to get this is where it starts to get interesting, and we start to get to the initial conception of the rhyme. So the earlier version, before that one, goes, "Hey, rub-a-dub-dub, 3 men in a tub, and who do you think they were? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all had just come from the fair." And so if we look at what they might have been doing in a fair, it becomes a little bit more obvious what's going on, because at fairs and places like that, there were often these sort of sideshow, peep show places. It was a sort of a traveling thing. Originally, it wasn't necessarily just a peep show, but it was in Europe in the 1400s, wandering artists and entertainers who came up with the idea of putting their art for their shows in a big portable wooden box. And the inside you could create scenery. It was just like a little mini stage, and you would look in through a little peephole and see the plays that were in there. Now, originally, this was probably a innocent enough kind of thing. They just wanted a stage, to see. But before long, somebody got the idea that, hey, this is an enclosed box. Most people aren't seeing it. You would have to pay to be able to see what's inside of it. We can put stuff in here that, the general population of the town wouldn't put up with seeing or would consider immoral. And that, in fact, is the origin of the peep show. And if you go back to a little bit earlier of the rhyme, it was Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 maids in a tub, and who do you think were there? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all of them gone to the fair. And then there's another version of the story in which they're told to Rub-a-dub-dub, 3 maids in the tub, and who were else but these? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, turn them out, knaves all 3. And so here we have the true origin of the story. In its original conception, this was a peep show being played by these wandering fairs, probably in the 1400s. And in it were these well-to-do men about town, a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. Sometimes it's a brewer, a baker, a candlestick maker. Those would have been comfortable, wealthy positions. And instead, they were not only found at the fair, but climbing into the tub to try to get with the women on the inside of it. And so it's kind of a morality lesson told in nursery rhyme form. What's really interesting to me is the earliest forms of this thing were popularized in about the 1400s. And this was told to children. This isn't necessarily a situation we would think of telling our kids today. Assuming that there was some tacky fair where there were peep shows and stuff like that, you would think if a kid says, "What's that?" you would more be like, "Oh, nothing, let's go get candy corn or whatever, cotton candy." But back then, the idea was that they were to be told exactly what was going on, given morality place, led into sort of all of the mysteries of adulthood. And this, to me, is another place where we can look at some very interesting cultural background, because this has to do with the changing nature of children. So we're talking about the 1400s, which was right about when the Protestant Reformation was taking place in Europe. And right when it hit, there was this switch for children. Or at least, young people back then. There wasn't as strong a conception of childhood as there is today. But there was this switch where, in the Catholic Church, once they had been baptized and received rites and things like that, they were more or less considered to be guaranteed salvation until they hit a certain later age, which wasn't old by any stretch of the imagination. I think it was like 9 or 10. But there was this age of non-accountability when they were young. And that was essentially overturned by the Protestant Reformation. They were considered to be in danger of hell if they weren't taken away or made sure to be safeguarded against sin. Adults would pose questions and children would learn appropriate responses by rote. And it was said parents could never start this too early with a catechism, even for children, quote, that are not past the breast yet, and behavior books for about 400 pages long for 5-year-olds. And so there was this state of angst about what to do with the kids and how to protect them. And so nursery rhymes, the kind of stories that you would tell kids and have them repeat and learn with these real easy to remember rhymes, would tackle these seriously adult situations. The situation of grown men running after a peep show at a fair or something like that. So just, sexual scenes and drunkenness and all kinds of things. It was considered very important, and indeed in the 14 and the 1500s, children were more or less seen as miniature adults. Once they were able to walk around, they did whatever work they could. They weren't really sheltered from public life, and that remained more or less constant up until honestly like the 1700s and 1800s. And what happened then was there was a romantic movement, and especially a romanticization of the innocence of childhood. And this started among the richer classes, specifically the nobility, aristocrats, things like that. They learned to really value the sort of innocence that comes with childhood, and there became this, I don't want to say obsession because I think it's healthy, but this desire to prolong the innocent state of childhood and to not burden children with what were considered to be the hard things of life. So that would be these adult situations. I mean, that would be sexuality, that would be a lot of the problems that exist in the adult world. And as luck would have it, at that point in time, 1700s, 1800s, or late 1700s, early 1800s, there was a middle class which was very keen to ape everything that the upper classes were doing and wanted themselves to seem that way too. And so this broad and growing middle class really pushed the idea of childhood being something special and set apart, and that it was healthy for a child to not have to deal with all those things early. And there was some pushback against that. I mean, there were conflicting reports from psychologists at that time, but social pressure prevailed, and then we ended up with the conception of childhood, which is really the way we have it today, which is that children ought not to be exposed to a variety of situations until they're old enough. And obviously, there's some pushback against that even today when it comes to limiting the kinds of media that children can watch and putting age restrictions on things. It's just kind of interesting that you can see this whole pendulum going back and forth. That, you know, you go back to the 1400s, and even the children rhymes are about three well-to-do men presumably getting drunk or just really eager and climbing into a tub in a peep show at a fair, and that's what's told to the kids. And then you can see it be tamed, you know, gradually. I mean, the next one is Rub-a-dub-dub, three maids in a tub, and who do you think were there? The butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, all of them gone to the fair. And so that's a little bit more winking at it, you know, not really talking about exactly what's happening there or calling them in knaves or anything like that. And then from there we go to just the absurd and the silly, rotten potatoes, and then almost the final versions that I was hearing was, you know, not anything about what they were doing at all, just that they were bad people. And we may be seeing a swing of the pendulum back now to where kids are exposed to more situations. They have more access to, you know, through the internet, through TV, and all these things, are starting to learn more about these situations. But it is interesting, at least, that in addition to the fairy tales, which are more things that adults tell each other, I mean, adults tell children these things too, but it wasn't always necessarily just kids telling kids. You know, there were political messages and subversive messages hidden in there. But even in the nursery rhymes that we tell each other, in these just silly little rhymes, you can really get a good barometer of what people valued, what people thought was important for children to know and to understand, and the values of the culture at large. Alright, so that is the nursery rhyme Rub-a-dub-dub featuring Butcher, Baker, and Candlestick Maker. Johann is having a much worse time than just being turned out of a tub these days, being pressured by Bloody Mary. But we will find out more about that in The Wolf Among Us to come. Thanks for joining me, and I will see you next time on the Book of Fables.